You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael. I am cameraless right now for the moment, moving some cameras around here in the studio and not up to par just yet. So I will be audio only, but joined by Louis Dizon and Samuel Green. We're talking the Jerusalem Church, Paul, and the New Testament. Welcome to the show, Pastor Green. How are you?
I'm going well, thank you, Michael. It's great to be with you again.
Yeah, great to have you back on. Louis, how you doing over there?
Doing well. I'm getting adjusted to, this new place. It's been about a month and a half since I moved, so
yeah,
I'm getting used to the rhythm of, how things are now.
Settling in. I see the books back there, the guitar, everything. It's shaping up.
Yep. Yeah. Still waiting on that guy who said he'd donate 2 new bookshelves for me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, still waiting on that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just taking a little while to send it over to Canada.
On a serious note, I do have a box of books in storage, so this is not my entire library. I just don't have space for every book that I have. So you only get to see the ones that I use most often.
I get it right now.
That seems to be the thing with all the video conferencing, to have a wall of books behind you.
Yeah.
Right now I'm in need of some additional shelves because I'm at the point where I'm now having to stack them up on top of other books, and I don't like that.
Yeah.
I want to be able to just put them on a bookshelf.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's dive in and talk about this. Now, Pastor Green, I don't know if you had a actual presentation that you wanted to go through.
I do. Let me
if
just
you
share
do,
that
I
with
can.
you now.
Yeah, you could share it on screen and we can go through it together. All right. We should be able. Yeah, we can see it now.
Let me just do this.
There we go.
All right. So would you like me to start?
Yeah,
now?
Go ahead. Take it away.
Okay, great. And again, as with all my time here, please just jump in at any point and draw out any comments or, observations that you make as I go through this. So the topic is the Jerusalem Church, Paul and the origin of the Gospels and the New Testament. And I'm bringing this subject up because, as someone who speaks with Muslims and to a lesser degree with secularists, this comes up, but certainly with Muslims, they repeat the arguments of liberal scholarship regarding the Gospels. In particular, that the Gospels are later products of the Christian community and therefore not from the apostles of Christ. And this seems to be the assumption amongst many scholars. And it's something that Muslims and others will bring up as a challenge to Christians and say, you see, you can't rely on the Bible, something along those lines. And so, for us who are Christians, we need to have an answer to this for ourselves, for an understanding of our own faith, but also so that we can answer Muslims and those who bring these types of charges to us. Now, typically when I started researching on this, I would be looking at statements made by the early church fathers. And so there'd be statements by Papias and Irenaeus. They wrote on this matter. But in this session, what I particularly want to consider is what the New Testament says about itself and its own origin, and particularly the origin of the Gospels, but then there'll just be a brief foray into the New Testament as a whole. And I say that because I guess I feel that in the discussions that I've been involved in, and it may, I don't see everything, but in the discussions that I've been involved in, I feel that what the New Testament says of itself just hasn't been given enough space, and that there's actually a lot of great stuff there that we need to be aware of. So I will head on down to my first slide. to make a start. I want to begin with Luke's explanation as to what he's doing. He says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account. And so my first point is, my first observations from this are that there's a number of people writing up accounts of Jesus' life. He obviously made an impact that people felt needed to be written up fairly soon. So we have this this writing of this. Luke is telling us that he gets his information from the eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And so he's actually giving us a fair bit of detail here. He's saying that these other books are being written. It's in the context of people writing about Jesus, and that he is going to the eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Now, the question then becomes, who are the eyewitnesses? And in Luke's writings in Luke and Acts, that phrase of being an eyewitness and a servant of the word is actually explained for us. And it's no surprise, but it's the apostles of Jesus, the 12. So I've got here, Luke has clearly explained the situation. Many people are writing accounts of Jesus' life, and he is writing an account based on the eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And so who are these? Who are these that he specifically identifies? Well, it's the 12 apostles. So you apostles, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And that idea of being a witness occurs a lot. And I've given you the other references there. Again, this is something I assume we're familiar with, but I want to go over it just so we can see that the New Testament does give us a lot of information. Luke's saying that he got his information from these people, from the 12 apostles. Okay. Now, I just want us to look at the 12 apostles and their role as Israelites, because the idea of being a witness to the works of God didn't begin with Jesus. This is actually the mission for the nation of Israel. So you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, Isaiah 43:10. And then a few verses later, I have revealed and saved and proclaimed, I am not some foreign God among you. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, that I am God. Do not tremble, do not be afraid. Did I not proclaim this and foretell it long ago? You are my witnesses. Now you see how in all of those verses, the nation of Israel is given revelation from God. They see the works of God. And so they're to be God's witness of these things and of his word to the world. We see this in Exodus 19, where God says out of all the nations, he's chosen the nation of Israel to be a priestly nation among the nations of the world. And so Israel had a prophetic mission to the nations, to witness about the works and commands of God. And the apostles of Jesus are completing this mission. So very often when we think of Jesus' sacrifice, we will think, oh yeah, there's that Old Testament precedent of the sacrificial system. Well, I want to say that when Jesus is talking about witnesses, that there's an established Old Testament precedent as well of the nation of Israel being this witnessing nation, being the nation who witnesses the works of God and proclaims and praises God's name to the world. And this is why it's an office, being a witness. It's an office that you could be called to. You saw the things, but then you were appointed to an office. And so when Judas dies, somebody needs to be appointed to replace him, but they need to be a witness to the works of God. Therefore, it is necessary to choose one of the men who has been with us the whole time the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from John's baptism to the time when Jesus was taken up from us. For one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection. So it's interesting, isn't it, that the person has to be a witness in that they've seen it, but they're going to become an official witness. Now, Luke records that the 12 apostles conducted their ministry from Jerusalem, and we see that in Paul's letter to Galatians as well, and that the character of their witness was to begin with John the Baptist, then speak of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. So here's just a typical example of what they give. So what was their witness? And this is from Acts 10. Then Peter began to speak, "You know what has happened throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism that John preached." So they always begin with John, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him from the dead on the third day and caused him to be seen. He was not seen by all the people, but by witnesses whom God had already chosen, by us who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one whom God appointed as the judge of the living and dead. Now you can see there that that's their witness, isn't it? From John the Baptist through to the proclaiming of the gospel. And again, it specifies on two occasions that they are particularly chosen to be witnesses to these works and to proclaim them. Now, what was their teaching? Well, their teaching and what they taught from Jesus was what they had heard from him. So we just read this: when Jesus had called the 12, so he set them out and went. So they set out and went from village to village, preaching the gospel and healing people everywhere. But notice what they're doing. They're already passing on Jesus' teaching. They're already proclaiming Jesus' commands during Jesus' time on earth. Okay, we see this again with the conclusion of Matthew. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you to the very end of the age. So they were taught by Jesus. He's called their rabbi, and they passed on his teaching and commands during his lifetime, but they continued to do this after his ascension. And so we see in the book of Acts, when the problem arises of pastoral needs within the church, that they say we shouldn't go doing all this administrative work within the church because we've got to devote ourselves to prayer and the ministry of the word. And so they appoint Stephen and deacons in the church. But notice what they're doing, that they're already involved in the ministry of the word. Now, they were involved in that ministry of the word when Jesus was alive, and now they're continuing it without Jesus being physically present, but they're involved in the word. Now, I just bring this up because it's not that at some later time they decided to start teaching. That's not the picture you get. The picture is they're already teaching during Jesus' lifetime. Luke actually gives us 3 occasions in which they're sent out on missions, 2 within Israel with Jesus, and then 1 finally without him, with him spiritually. So this ministry of the word is integral to what they were doing. He was their rabbi, and people passed on the traditions and teachings of their rabbi. And in many ways, the witness that they have and the commands, I was talking about the witness to what Jesus had done and the commands that he gave, but they go together. They go together because the witness provides the historical context for the commands that Jesus gives. You know, when Jesus talks about marriage, it's in a historical context. There are people who are asking this question. It's very different to say the book of Thomas that you may have seen, where it's just a whole lot of sayings of Jesus. and there's no historical context really. It's just sayings. The Gospels have this witness and command that go together. There's the historical context and the commands that Jesus gave. And this is what the disciples are passing on. Just as the law of Moses in the Old Testament is given in a historical context, we see Jesus' commands are given in a historical context as well. And I want to say, if Jesus is their teacher and he's their rabbi, then it would be odd if they didn't do this. For those who want to say the disciples did nothing, that Jesus was their rabbi, but they just did nothing for decades, why would they do nothing if he's their rabbi? They're going to do at least the normal practice. Now, this witness and this teaching from the Jerusalem church is called from the Lord. It's from the Lord. So he who listens to you listens to me. He who rejects you rejects me. But he who rejects me rejects him who sent me. And so what they're passing on in their teaching, that this is from the Lord. This is how Luke explains it. This is the teaching from the Lord, what he commanded the disciples. They are passing on the commands of the Lord. It's from the Lord. And so I want to say that the Jerusalem church was busy with their prophetic role. Right? From the beginning, they are busy with their prophetic role, understanding themselves as the true Israel, the 12 who are going to judge Israel, the 12 apostles with this ministry role, and they're busy in this prophetic role, and they see it as prophetic because that's how you would understand Israel and witness in a prophetic sense. Now, I want to change tacks now and talk about Paul and the Jerusalem church, because the Jerusalem church is different to Paul. Paul was a witness to the resurrection, and he did learn the gospel by direct revelation from God. He says that in Galatians. He says, no one taught it to me. God revealed his son directly to me. And so he learned that Jesus was the Messiah, and that he died for our sins, and it all came together for him by direct revelation. But he was not a witness to Jesus' ministry or to the teaching of Jesus in that historical sense. And we actually see that he defers to the Jerusalem church in Acts 13. And this is one of those speeches of Paul's that I'd read for years, and I hadn't actually noticed the last sentence. I'm just going to read it to you, and just notice what the last sentence says. Before the coming of Jesus, this is Paul preaching in a synagogue. Before the coming of Jesus, John preached repentance and baptism to all the people of Israel. Notice again where he starts, John. As John was completing his work, he said, "Who do you think I am? I am not the one. No, but he is coming after me, whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. Brothers, children of Abraham, and you God-fearing Gentiles, it is to us that this message of salvation has been sent. The people of Jerusalem and their rulers did not recognize Jesus, yet in condemning him, they fulfilled the words of the prophet that are read every Sabbath. Though they found no proper grounds for a death sentence, they asked Pilate to have him executed. When they had carried out all that was written about him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in the tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to our people." And I just particularly want us to look at this down here, this last sentence. Paul does not say, we are witnesses, or I am a witness to these things. He says they, and who are the they? Well, the they in context are those who had traveled with him. And so I just want us to see here how Paul distinguishes his witness from the witness of the Jerusalem church. Right? There's a difference here. The 12 who were with Jesus saw what he did, heard his commands in context, and that's different to Paul. Now, I'm not saying that Paul's not an apostle or anything like that, but I'm saying he has a different type of witness. He has a different type of witness. So we see here that Paul defers to and passes on the witness of the Jerusalem church, and that this is the character of his ministry. So he actually calls this, and we're going to look at this in detail in a moment, but in 1 Corinthians, he actually refers to the teaching that we find in the Gospels, which is the testimony we'll look at in a moment, which as the testimony of the Jerusalem church. Paul refers to this teaching explicitly, and he seems to call it the law of Christ in 1 Corinthians 9:21, or in 1 Timothy 3:6-4. He says, he talks about his own teaching that he passes on, but says it must also conform to the words of our Lord Jesus Christ. And these words seem to be this testimony of the Jerusalem church, possibly information that Paul's got directly from Jesus, because he did have a direct engagement with Jesus as well. But certainly from what we can see in 1 Corinthians, he's referring to the historical events and the historical commands, which he was not a witness to. Now, as I said, Paul does have his own teaching, and it seems that he gives both of them in his churches. And so the apostles worked in complementary ways. And so now I'll come back to this in a moment, but we're going to see that Paul, when he started his churches, was actually passing on the witness of the Jerusalem church, the witness and the commands from the Jerusalem church. And as we can see how Paul is doing this, we can see that the New Testament, in a sense, has already begun, in that the churches are already getting teaching from both the apostles, the Jerusalem church, and from Paul. They're already getting teaching from both churches, from both sources. And so you've got this New Testament idea already beginning. Now, I'm going to look at a couple of examples and we'll have a break. I want to look at a few examples from his letters and see this in practice. Now, Paul planted the church in Corinth about the year 50 AD 50, and we can establish that quite accurately. That's only 17 years after Jesus was on earth. That's actually not that long, 17 years. And he wrote a letter to them about the year AD 52. So this is early. This is much earlier than Papias, much earlier than Irenaeus. This is early. Now, what do we see when we read this? He says, "For I received from the Lord what I passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me.'" So here is Paul saying, I've already passed this on to you. I received from the Lord what I passed on to you. Now, remember that idea that I received this from the Lord, that's how the Gospels talk about their commands. It's from the Lord. And so this is the witness of the Jerusalem church that he's passed on to them when he started the church. Okay, so when Paul's planting churches, he's actually including in his ministry the testimony of the Jerusalem church, at least for the Corinthians. I'm not sure exactly what point it begins, but it's at least begun by 17 years after Jesus. And when we look at the phrases there, of course, they're basically verbatim what we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I want to say that these are actually the earliest New Testament quotes. We often look to the early church fathers to say where are the New Testament quotes first happening, but we actually see Paul quoting the Jerusalem church, and I want to argue this is the earliest quote that we get, that we see, and it's only 17 years after Jesus. And what's interesting is that it's basically precisely the same as what we have in the Gospels. So the gospel material from the Jerusalem church was in a fixed form and was being used by the churches, being used in the churches by Paul within 17 years. And the gospel material was already in a quotable form, right? And it's being treated as scripture, as the Lord's command. That is, it's been published. This stuff has been published. Okay. Now, this is the character of Paul's ministry. He's passing on exactly the material. So I'm not saying he's quoting Matthew, Mark, and Luke in that form, but I'm saying that body of material has been published. It's being used in ministry by other apostles. It's quotable. It's in a fixed form, and it's being treated as scripture. This is just what we can tell within Paul's use of this. And what's more than that, he's been using it in his ministry for decades. Now, I'll come back to this. So I want to give another example now. Look at this one. And this one's often used against Christians. This one's often used against Christians. It says, to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest, I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. Now, I'm sure you know, Lewis, and you've probably heard this, that people will be critical of Christianity and say, look at this is just Paul's own opinion. You know, in the first line, he says, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. But then later on, he says, to the rest, I say this, not the Lord. And so people will say, well, this is just Paul's opinion. And it shows that this is not the word of God. And, have you heard that type of argument used?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
It's a fairly frequent one.
Yeah. Now, this scripture actually proves the exact opposite. It proves the exact opposite. Let me show you what I mean. It actually shows us that Paul did not add to the words of Jesus when he didn't have them. Right? He is not inventing words of Jesus like people claim. So in form criticism, they will say, as different situations arose within the church, stories about Jesus were either invented or modified and, to answer certain situations that arose in the church. Well, here's a situation in the church, a very early situation. Someone becomes a Christian and they're not married to a Christian. It's a very early situation for the Christians. But Paul is explicit here that he doesn't have a word from Jesus on this. Now, I want to say to you, that is transparency. Paul is being transparent. He tells you when he does not have a command from Jesus. And I want to say, I find this amazing. And I find it a confirmation that he's not making things up. It's just an incidental statement that he makes. He's just making it en route amongst other, while he's teaching things. But the evidence that Paul actually gives is that he's being faithful to what he's received from the Jerusalem church. And so we know where those commands of Jesus come from, don't we, about marriage? Matthew 19 would be an example of that. And then there's a parallel one in Mark's gospel where Jesus basically says divorce is not the Christian way. And so you can see where he's got it from. But Jesus spoke in a Jewish context, and he wasn't addressing mixed marriages. And so Paul knows that he just can't take that directly to this different situation. Now, those who say that Paul changed the message of Jesus, that they actually need to give some evidence for this. They need to give some evidence, because I want to argue the evidence shows the exact opposite. Now, Paul is still an apostle of Jesus, so he still gives a ruling as a spirit-inspired prophetic apostle of Jesus. He gives a ruling for this new situation, and so it is a command for Jesus. It's not a command that came to him from a revelation or anything like that. He's got the commands of Jesus from this fixed body of teaching that he's received from the Jerusalem church. Now, I find that amazing. I find that a real confirmation that these verses are telling us great things. Now, I'm going to just do this really quick now, so we've got plenty of time because there's a bit more material in here than needs to be. But why is this important? Well, we've seen that Paul is using the material of the Jerusalem church in his ministry. Now, Luke, as we read in the book of Acts from chapter 16 onwards, where he includes himself in the narrative, we see that he becomes a traveling companion of Paul. And he's actually explicitly spoken about in Colossians, 2 Timothy, and Philemon. In Acts 21, he visits Jerusalem, and that is, Luke is actually involved in gospel ministry with Paul for about a decade. He's been up to Jerusalem. Now, if you're in gospel ministry with Paul, guess what? You've been using the testimony and the teaching of the Jerusalem church in your ministry to the churches that you've been planting with Paul. Okay, so Luke has actually been involved for 10 years of ministry in using, in practice, the teaching from the Jerusalem church of Jesus' commands and Jesus' life from John the Baptist through to the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. He's an essential figure. Now, that matters, of course, because he's the one who writes the gospel. Right? He's not just like a journalist who has to investigate many subjects, and, journalists that they don't know much about any one subject because they have to, that's just the nature of the job. They have to learn lots of stuff, a little bit about everyone to write it up. Luke is actually been using this material for years when he writes up the gospel. And so when Luke is writing up this material, he's writing up, as he claims, the testimonies of the Jerusalem church. And so he's intimately involved with these people. He's been intimately involved in it. And so it's not just any old person writing up a gospel. Now, Mark is the same. Mark is actually even earlier than Luke. Mark's right there at the beginning with Peter. He's there with the original 12. He's on mission with Peter. He's helping Peter write his letters. He's on mission with Barnabas and Paul. So you can see how the Jerusalem church and Paul are working together. He's mentioned in Paul's letters as being involved in Paul's mission. And so when Mark comes to write up his gospel, again, he's not just someone who just sits down, because if you just read Papias or something, you might get the idea that Mark just sat down and Peter just told it to him and he just wrote down what Peter said. I'm not saying he didn't write down what Peter said, but what I'm saying is that there's a much bigger picture here. There's a much bigger picture if we just take the time to look at what are just the incidental material that we see within the documents themselves. That Mark is actively involved in Christian ministry for longer than Luke. He's actively involved for several decades, maybe 3 or 4 decades of Christian ministry. And he's the one who writes it up. So it's not just an outsider, it's someone who's part of the team, part of the group, been working in the ministry for decades, and then he writes it up. Now, again, why is it important? Well, I've said because Mark writes it up and he writes our gospel for us. And so the gospel of Mark contains the exact material of the testimony and teaching of the Jerusalem church. And again, as I said, we can confirm this back to AD 7, back to about 50 AD, it should be AD 50, that material was already in quotable form and it's just been brought together. Now, I want to finish up quickly. Matthew's in the same style, so it comes from the same stock of witness and ministry. So it's originating from the apostles in the Jerusalem church. And to conclude, now, when it comes to dating the Gospels, this is the point I want to get to. There's a false impression that can be given when people give dates. They'll say 80 AD or 70 AD, and it's quite speculative how they get these dates anyway, but they give the impression that this is when the book was written, and the impression can be given, and that's when the book started to be known. That's when the material started to be known. And I just want Christians to think through with this. Regardless of when the Gospels were written, regardless of the dates, and I actually don't think we can know these dates with hardly any precision, but regardless of when they were written, the material that is in them was already in a published, quotable, fixed form at the maximum of 17 years after Jesus' ascension. So that material it's already fixed. It's already been quoted. It's already been used in ministry. It gets written up later on. So regardless of when it is, when they're written, that's not when these stories are known to the church. They're already known there from the beginning, from when they're being started. And then my last point is simply this. I want to encourage all you Christians out there to be like the Apostle Paul. Be like the Apostle Paul. Paul took the teachings of the Jerusalem church and he used it in his ministry. He took the commands of Jesus as found in this fixed form that we find in the Gospels today, and he was sharing that with the churches in his day. And that's exactly what, we want to make sure continues to happen in our churches. And as we're sharing the gospel with others, we can do exactly what those first apostles were doing as we share the gospels with those around us. I'll finish up there. There we go. So I'll just get rid of that now.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that presentation. So I was taking down a few notes while you were doing it, and what I've tried to do is place myself in the shoes of a hypothetical critic who is not convinced that the Gospels are reliable and maybe looking for possible holes in your arguments to exploit. Maybe I can run some possible objections your way to see how you tackle
Please
them.
do.
All right. So, a lot of your argumentation is based on trying to make the case that St. Paul was fundamentally in continuity with the teaching of the early church. Now, you're probably aware that there's this common narrative in a lot of New Testament circle studies that asserts that St. Paul actually broke with the teaching of the Jerusalem church to form a sort of Pauline Christianity, quote unquote, that would be more appealing to Gentiles. And there are a number of pieces of evidence that they would use to make that claim. So they would say, for example, that if you look at Galatians chapter 2, St. Paul seems to be implicitly beefing with certain representatives of the Jerusalem church who were sent up to Antioch by St. James. Or somebody might point to the fact that at least at face value, it looks like the Epistle of James has a very different soteriology from St. Paul, like it has a different view of the relationship between faith and works in relation to justification. So how do you respond to this narrative as well as the arguments that are often used to support it?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I would, in responding to you, I just need to respond to the two lots of evidence that you gave. I'll begin with the last one first, because that's probably one I can just do a little quicker. I want to argue that the book of James teaches exactly the same thing as Paul. So I don't think there's a distinction there. Galatians and the book of James are speaking to opposite groups. Paul is speaking in the book of in the letter to the Galatians. He's speaking to people who think that they can keep the law of God. That in order to be properly justified, they must keep the Old Testament law. And what he says to them is, well, if you're going to do that, you've got to keep the whole lot. You've got to keep it perfectly. But that's the context. He's speaking to people who believe they need to keep it. James is speaking to people the exact opposite. They are people who are saying, oh, saved by faith, I don't have to do the law at all. The law is irrelevant to me. So you can see how they're radically different groups. And the context does matter. The context does matter. Now, what's interesting is that if you go to James, he actually says precisely the same thing about the law that Paul does in Galatians. Let me just see. Let's just see if I can find it. He says in chapter 2, verse 10, "For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. Now, that's precisely what Paul says. I think it's in Galatians chapter 3. So they both have actually the same gospel understanding, that if you're going to try to live by law, you've got to obey the whole thing. And if you break one law, it's as if you've broken it all. That's from James. Now, from there, they then go out to their very different contexts. And as I said, James is speaking to people who say, I just have faith and it doesn't matter what I do. Paul's saying to people, I have faith and what I do is actually going to save me. And so, they're radically different. So I would say that chapter 2, verse 10 shows that Paul and James actually have the precise same understanding that no one can keep the law and that we need the salvation of God. And so I wouldn't agree that Paul and James are contradictory there. Did you want to push back at any point with that one?
Well, actually, I think that is a good point, that they are actually differences in emphases rather than real differences in belief. And in fact, I would add this to support your point. If you know where to look in St. Paul's writings, he does present a high view of the law as well. Like in Romans 3, verse 31, he states that, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. And then in 1 Timothy 1, verse 8, he says, now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. Now, there are certain people who will try to question whether St. Paul actually wrote 1 Timothy, but that's a whole separate discussion right there. On a related note, on this whole narrative that St. Paul broke with the Jerusalem church, a lot of the arguments for him being in continuity with the Jerusalem church hinge upon St. Luke's account in the book of Acts. But a lot of the people who make this narrative will say that Luke's account in Acts is actually historically unreliable on the grounds that being Paul's traveling companion, Luke would have had a vested interest in downplaying any possible differences that may have existed between Paul and James and the other Jerusalem apostles. And perhaps Acts may be a deliberate attempt to cover up those differences. So how would you respond to that claim?
Well, I guess I'd say two things. I mean, if we're going to move into the conspiracy theory, I mean, this is where you're at. You're now saying we can't take it on what it says, and that in order to substantiate my view, I've got to say this story is functioning in a way that it's not appearing to function. So we need to be honest about that. That in order to make these claims, you've got to say, in order for me to prove my point, I can't take the Bible as it stands. Okay. Now, at that point, when the next theory comes along in 20 years' time, they're going to have a different view on how it should be read. So, let's at least be honest with that. So my second point would be that I think Luke is actually quite fair in the way he deals with things. He puts forward the argument with Barnabas and Paul, and he doesn't glorify Paul in that. He actually puts forward Paul as being, a little cantankerous, and Barnabas is the son of encouragement. Barnabas is the one who says, no, let's go back and get Mark. And Paul's going, I don't want to take him. And, Barnabas is the good guy out of the two. And then it has them, he has, I think it's chapter 13 or 15. I'm sorry, I should know that. But it's where they have the Jerusalem Council. And 15. He goes up for that. And he doesn't really glorify Paul in this. He just has people, like, it just seems to be a fairly honest discussion. I mean, I don't pick up anything in particular that vindicate Paul, or sorry, maybe vindicate's not the correct word, but excuse Paul in any way. I mean, and also it starts off with Peter and those as being good and right and proper. And so,
it's good that you mentioned Acts 15, because I think this is precisely that the one narrative in all of Acts that the critics who want to downplay the reliability of Acts will want to focus on. And I think the reason why they do make that move is because, as you can see in Acts 15, St. James actually agrees or ratifies the judgment of Jerusalem Council, stating that Gentile converts do not need to be circumcised to become Christians. But on the other hand, if we go back to Galatians 2, I believe I'm looking for the one. So in verse 12, Paul says, "For before certain men came from James, he was eating with Gentiles, but when they came back, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party." So it's sort of implying that the circumcision party came to Antioch under orders from James. And I think that is based on that argument, they would, adhere, at least critics who use this narrative will say that according to Galatians 2:12, James was actually part of the circumcision party himself. And Acts 15 is an attempt to switch him over to the other side, as it were.
Yeah, but again, I would come back to Galatians, because within Galatians himself, Paul does say of Peter later on in chapter 2, he goes, "I opposed Peter to his face for not eating with Gentiles." And then but a bit earlier, he says that he went up to Jerusalem, he met with them, and in Paul's words, James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. When they recognized that the grace had been given to me, they agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. And so my point there is, he doesn't write up and say James is wrong. He's already said Peter's wrong. So he could have said that this was not resolved with James. I just feel that people are just, they've got to take something from one part and then say, well, the other part they've got to take something from Galatians and then say, well, Luke doesn't match up with this, when I want to say it does. And therefore Luke must be written, to cover something up. And again, as soon as you start saying it's written to cover it up, does it really cover it up? I don't know. You can say anything. What I've just tried to do is to look at the fact, which is what I want to get back to, and that is that I think all scholars are going to agree with what they call the Jesus tradition from the Jerusalem church. Right? They all agree with the Jesus tradition from the Jerusalem church, and we see Paul using that tradition in his ministry, and that's why I want to come back to what we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and chapter 7, where we see Paul using the commands of Jesus from the Jerusalem church in his ministry, and how he's saying, I don't have a word from Jesus here, I do on this occasion. And to me, that just shows there's a harmony, there's a working that's happening there. I'm not saying the guys didn't have arguments with each other. Sure, they have arguments. Luke is honest about that, but that doesn't mean they're contradictory. I mean, I've had arguments with people. It doesn't mean all of a sudden I've got a different gospel. Just because I have an argument with a Christian doesn't mean I have a different gospel. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. One thing I would add to your point, just because the circumcision party came from James doesn't mean they're representing the views of James. In fact, I believe that if you read closely, St. Paul is implicitly denying that claim to them, because 3 verses earlier in Galatians 2:9, it says, "And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and to me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised." So there's this implicit acknowledgement that James endorses the ministry of Paul, and he recognizes that his ministry is to the uncircumcised and theirs is to the circumcised. I think if you read closely, that other elements of the text do undermine the narrative that we're referring to. So here's one other question that I want to throw at you. One of the things that critics sometimes like to say with regards to Saint Paul is that it's interesting how little of Jesus' actual words he refers to, or how little of Jesus' life and ministry he refers to. Sure, he refers to the words of institution. He makes a passing reference to death and resurrection, but there's large chunks of Jesus' life that he just passes over in silence. He doesn't even mention the virgin birth, for example. And from that, a lot of these critics will make the inference that perhaps St. Paul didn't know about these elements of Jesus' life. How would you respond to that claim?
Yeah. I would say that, first of all, we do have evidence that he's quoting the commands of Jesus that were given in a historical context. And so it's not that there's no evidence there, there is some. And so, they mustn't give an impression that there's none, right? He obviously knows, the worker is worthy of his wage, which he says on a couple of occasions. And I've showed the 1 Corinthians 11:1. I've just been reading, where's that? Oh, I've taken it downstairs now. I've just been reading Jesus, Paul, and the Gospels by, what's his name? Oh, sorry, I'm just thinking on my feet here. He's that real big scholar. Anyway, I'll remember in a moment. He was saying, and this is something that I've actually started to collect.
By the way, is it James Dunn?
James Dunn. That's it, James Dunn.
Yes.
And I was just finishing off, I think it's chapter 2 at the end. And he brings up a point, and it's something that I'd started to make a file on, and I've been adding to it. Paul will talk about not causing people to stumble. Don't cause people to stumble. So 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. As well. And so Jesus, when they have the temple tax, he talks about not causing people to stumble. And it's the exact same word, and it's the idea of not causing the little one to stumble. And so when you actually go through Paul's teaching, while he may not be quoting Jesus' teaching, sometimes he does give the odd quote. Very often what he says, you can locate straight back into the Gospels. And it's almost as if he's just taken that on and he's just applying it. Sometimes he quotes it, sometimes he doesn't. So I guess that's the two ways that I would see Paul interacting with the testimony of the Jerusalem church. Direct quotes, of which there's not many, but there are a few. But then overwhelmingly, that he's now thinking in those categories of what Jesus taught. And sometimes we can go directly back to that. Anyway, it's James Dunn. He can direct you to studies which have been done on looking at how Paul's been influenced by the teaching of Jesus. Now, that was part of it. Was there something else in your question? I'm trying to remember.
Not necessarily. I just wanted to bring that up because I know that is something that, whenever we're talking about the life of Jesus, the historical Jesus, especially as it relates to the ministry of Paul, this is one objection that always comes up.
Sorry, the other point I wanted to say was his silence doesn't mean he didn't know about it. From my perspective, his silence would be that he saw that as the testimony, which he says in Acts 13, he saw that testimony to the life and the teachings of Jesus as that's what the Jerusalem church provide. So he gives those traditions, whether they're oral or written, however they were, he gives those to the churches, but they're not in his personal writings because he's not testifying to that. So again, I think the absence of that type of material is simply like saying, the book of Proverbs doesn't have all of the book of Genesis in it, or the book of Isaiah doesn't have all of the Joseph story in it. Why doesn't Isaiah have the Joseph story in it? They're parallel prophets. They're doing they're involved in the same ministry, but they have different ministries and different things to say.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you for bringing that up. I also want to touch on something that you mentioned towards the end, and that's your view on the dating of the Gospels. If I recall correctly, you said that you would date them to like within 17 years of Jesus' life and ministry. Am I right?
No, what
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
saying, no, what I'm
Yeah.
saying is that when the Gospels were actually put together, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are put together from the material that we see being used by the Apostle Paul in his ministry within 17 years of Jesus' ascension. Okay, so
Okay.
we can, right? So my point is that when scholars say the date of Matthew is, say, 80, AD 80, when they say 80, AD 80, very often people then make a wrong impression from this. They create a false impression. And I guess what I'm just finding is that a lot of argumentation is based on false impressions. So you say something that's true, but you create an impression into a new area, which is not valid. And I guess I just feel prey to this a lot. And I'm just starting to see how much impressions are used in argumentation. And so my point here is, even if Matthew was written in 80 AD, and I'm not saying it is, and what I said is I don't think we can actually accurately know, but we'll assume Matthew was written AD 80, okay? You cannot from that then say that's when people started to know about the material that we see in Matthew, right? It's not that from the year 80 AD was when that material starting, is being used. What I'm saying is it's being used basically from the very beginning. We see the Apostle Paul using it in quotable, fixed, published forms 17 years after the ascension of Jesus. Now, there comes a time when it's written up in various forms, but that's not when it starts. That's my point.
Mhm.
See the distinction there?
Right. I understand that.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, though, if you were to take a stab at trying to figure out the date of the Gospels, where would you place them?
Yeah, look, the only one that I feel that I can have a good shot at is Luke and Acts, because I'm still convinced by the fact that
Mhm.
Acts does not finish with the execution of Paul. And we know that Luke is with Paul throughout this time. And we know that, it's been speaking about his execution, and it just seems to finish just before it. And it seems to me that, Luke has recorded, obviously, the death of Jesus, the death of Stephen, the death of, I think no, not James, probably just Stephen. So he's more than happy to record the early Christian leaders' deaths. It's not that he doesn't want to include it. And to me, to not have Paul's death says it couldn't have happened by this time. And so to me, that's how I look at it. And so I think, he's writing up, and I'm happy for other information, but I like to let books date themselves. And I'm not trying to be,
Right.
I'm not trying to be overly, this is the word of God. I'm just trying to be honest to what the books say of themselves.
Yeah. This is another point that is worth noting here, but one of the pastoral epistles, either First or Second Timothy, I forget which one, quotes from Luke. The labor is worthy of his wages.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, the Pauline authorship of the pastoral epistles is disputed in a lot of New Testament studies today. But if you can make the case that St. Paul wrote the pastoral epistles, then that would make for a solid evidence that Luke's gospel was already written within his lifetime. Another thing that I want to mention, I think your argument for Luke and Acts being dated before St. Paul's death is solid, and I think you can make the inference from that at least one of the other gospels is similarly to be dated early. Now, the vast majority of people hold to Markan priority. A smaller number will hold to Matthean priority. But whichever one you think was written first, that would have to also be dated early, because then that would be the gospel that St. Luke is relying upon to form his account.
Yes, I agree. And so we're going to say that, it's obviously earlier than 60, was it 64 or 62? I can't remember, with the Apostle Paul's crucifixion. It's a rough, it's the early 60s.
It was definitely around the time of the Emperor Nero, so somewhere between 64 and 66 would be a good date.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, just with the dating of the epistles, I mean, one of the things I'm doing at the moment is, and this is a sneak preview, is I'm reading this book with a friend, Jesus Interpreted by Bart Ehrman, and he goes through all these arguments. And what I find is that when you go through them, they are really poor. I realize that people will just say the epistles weren't written by Paul, but when you actually look at the reasons they give, and we could do this on another episode because it opens up a whole new section, but the reasons actually aren't very good. And very often they're circular reasons, in that if I've got a view of Paul and 2 Timothy doesn't fit into my view of Paul, then 2 Timothy mustn't be written by Paul. And that is very often the logic of how these arguments go. They say, we know this, we've got this, and it's certain, therefore other things can't fit in. And you go, well, it's circular reasoning. And I think the great thing about reading Bart Ehrman's book, and I'm going to be doing some videos on it later on, is that he brings this up. And for us as Christians, there can be this almost impenetrable wall of scholars say and academics say, and so you don't actually know what they say, and they very rarely give you the evidence, or it's in too much data. Ehrman brings it all down, and you can actually look at it, and Ehrman says these are the reasons, and so you go and read them. I'll just give you one example. They'll say, in 1 Timothy, they'll go, there are words in there that Paul doesn't use in other letters. And so this is one of the common arguments. There are words that we don't find in the other letters of Paul. Okay. And so you go, oh, okay. And it sounds reasonable. But again, this is this false impression, because if you take any of Paul's letters, there are words unique to that letter which aren't in the other letters. So Romans will have words which he doesn't use elsewhere. Right. And so it's a nonsense argument, but it's seriously put forward by academics, and they say, there are words which aren't anywhere else. And you go, well, okay, but then you read Don Carson or another scholar, and they'll say, yeah, but hang on, every epistle has unique words that don't appear anywhere else. What's the point? And anyway, you get my idea. That these arguments very often have very quick answers, and they've only gained ground because they create an impression. But as I said, that's maybe for another time.
It's funny. You mentioned Jesus Interrupted, and I actually wrote an article. It's in the Reason in Theology website, called "A Case for Bible Harmonization," which interacts a bit with Jesus Interrupted. One of the things that I find, which is a little bit disconcerting but not surprising with Ehrman, is that he is very dismissive of the idea of trying to harmonize apparent contradictions in the Bible. He'll say that if you're an honest person, you'll just acknowledge that there are obviously contradictions in the Gospels, and any attempt to make them fit with one another is just, mental gymnastics, or trying to get around what for him is the obvious. Although, what I find is that what's obvious for one person isn't necessarily the same for another. Like for me, a lot of these Bible harmonizations seem pretty plausible, and I think there's no reason why they shouldn't be accepted, other than sheer prejudice against a more traditional view of the Gospels.
Absolutely. I've just found Ehrman horrendous to read. he would just start off by saying, he'll start a chapter by saying, now we all know that the Bible is just full of corruption, all right? And it's contradictions and everything else. And so like he'll begin like that. And then he'll say, now here are my examples. And then you go through them and you go, actually, none of these hold water. And so that's why I'm going to be doing a series on going through this book, because Ehrman creates this impression. Again, it comes back to creating impressions. It's not facts. He creates impressions, and people are led by impressions. People are impressed. And so I think we need to call it out. We need to call out impressions that are made and help people to see this. And that's a little project I got ticking away.
Yeah, I do have one more question. It's a little bit tangential, but it is related to what we're discussing right now. You're familiar with the current dispute. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but the disagreement between Mike Licona and Lydia McGrew on how to deal with apparent differences between the Gospels. You know how Licona wrote this book on gospel differences, arguing that they're the result of various literary devices that the authors picked up from the Greco-Roman biography genre, whereas McGrew would dispute that point, saying that it would be bad for the reliability of the Gospels, and she opts for more old-fashioned harmonization. I'm just curious, what's your take on that debate?
Yeah, so I've seen a number of videos where Mike Licona was asked questions, what do you think's the hardest contradiction in the New Testament? And he spoke one about Jesus traveling around the Sea of Galilee from one place to another. And so I looked at that and I went, oh, okay, this is what he says is the hardest one. So I went and had a look at it. And I actually thought of a solution almost within 5 minutes. And that was in one gospel account. I'd have to go and dig this out because I'm not prepared for this at the moment. But in one gospel account, he says Jesus says they're going to leave one place and go to another place. Whereas in another gospel account, it says he's going to leave the same place, but go to a different place. And Mike was saying, this is really hard. It can't be harmonized. But I just went and got a map. And what I saw was that both were actually true. And what I mean by that is they both say Jesus is starting at the right place. But in order to get to the further place, you've actually got to go past the other place, if you know what I mean. And so, if you're rowing one of those old boats, you can't, you're not going to row for 20 kilometers, right? You're going to go along the coastline. You're going to stop at towns. And so, I live in, say, I'll use some big, some capital cities, but I'd say, if I lived in Sydney and I'm going to Perth in Western Australia, now I could say, I'm going to Perth. Let's go to Perth. Or I could say, let's go to Melbourne, because I've got to go to Melbourne, which is going to be my stopover before I go to Perth. Now, am I saying a contradiction? One says I'm going to Melbourne, one says I'm going to Perth. Right. And when I looked at it and I looked at the towns on the map, they're just the stopover towns that you would go on the way to get supplies. And, after you've been rowing for a couple of hours, you pull into shore and you have a rest. And I just thought there's an easy solution to that. And so I was pretty unhappy with his approach. And so, I'm much more down the, was it Lydia McGrew? I've forgotten her name now.
Yeah, Lydia McGrew wrote the book, The Mirror or the Mask, where she critiques Licona's book.
Yeah, I've got that. I've got her other one up here somewhere. Yeah.
So,
no, you go.
No, I'm just saying, my personal view, I like both of them. I'm probably more sympathetic to McGrew's position, but I'm not 100% on that.
Yeah, and it's the same with me. I mean, I'll listen to what Mike's got to say. Good on him, he's a good brother. But I've just found that he gives examples that I often find answers to in 5 minutes, and I'm going, wow. But again, see, this is where I think someone can have a literary understanding of the text, and they're saying the text is like this, and then so other information sort of has to fit in there. Well, I'm just saying, well, I'm just going to.
Yeah.
It's not that I don't have an understanding of the text, but I'm just saying, well, I'm going to take the text as it is. It's claiming to be from the eyewitnesses, and that's just how I'm going to assume it to be. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. The other one that comes to mind is the temple cleansing. You know how John puts it at the beginning, whereas the synoptics place it at the end. Like Conan has this long thing about how, obviously St. John moved the temple cleansing to the beginning of Jesus' ministry for theological purposes, whereas, Craig Blomberg, in his book on the historical reliability of Gospels, makes a pretty compelling case, in my opinion, that Jesus could have cleansed the temple twice. There's all sorts of things that Jesus did more than once. Why can't the temple cleansing be one of them?
Yes. Yeah, and particularly as John's Gospel gives us gives us more years, in a sense. You know how the synoptics don't really give us the same time frame as John. They don't mention as many festivals. I'll say Jesus went around teaching in this region. How long was he teaching in all their synagogues for? Might have been years. Whereas John will actually say, there was this Passover. I think he mentions 3 or 4 Passovers, and so it's more. He's just recording more stuff in that sense.
There is a question here
Yeah.
from the audience. It is from John, and he's asking, what is your view of Chaim Maccabee and his book, The Mythmaker, Paul and the Invention of Christianity?
Thank you for that question. I have not read that book. I've read and done a lot of thinking about this issue, but I haven't read that book in particular, so I don't know what he says. But I would just come back to the evidence that I've presented here, and I'd want to say I have not seen any evidence to the contrary. Right? I mean, if I look at the evidence that I have of Paul, I see him using the material of the Jerusalem church, and I would argue that that's where reasonable scholars today are landing. So coming back to who was that scholar we mentioned before? Sorry, I got a terrible memory today.
Maccabee.
No, the one I mentioned.
James Dunn.
James Dunn. So for the person asking the question, I'd direct you to James Dunn's book on Jesus, Paul, and the Gospels. And Dunn makes it very clear. He says, Paul is not inventing this, right? Paul's not inventing it. He's getting it and passing it on. He has his own experience of Jesus, yes, but the Gospels, Paul is using the testimony of the Jerusalem church. And as I said, the very character of the New Testament is that it is from different apostles. Right? When the church, we've got to look at that. We've got to acknowledge it. It's not like the Quran. The Quran is just one man and what he tells you about everyone else. But the New Testament's not like that. The early Christians, they've got some of Paul's writings, some of John's writings, some of James' writings, from Matthew, Mark, Luke. They've got different sources. And this is because this was the character of the early church, that they had different writings from different apostles. And so it's not just from Paul. If the New Testament was just from Romans to Philemon, then okay, we'd have a case for saying, how faithfully did Jesus pass on the teaching of Jesus if all we had was Romans to Philemon? And that's what Marcion wanted to do, right? Just have Romans to Philemon. In that case, I could see how we could entertain this question. But when we've got all these other writings from other apostles in completely different styles, explaining Jesus in completely different ways, they're obviously not Pauline, but they're all in there. So, I don't think we should ignore the obvious.
Yeah. While we're at this, I also want to plug a book of myself. When it comes to this thesis that Paul broke with the Jerusalem Church to form Christianity, the definitive book refuting this view is by David Wenham. It's called Paul, Follower of Jesus or Founder of Christianity. Like anyone who has encountered this claim should look up this book and get a copy of it. It will systematically debunk all of the arguments that are used to support this claim.
All right. I really want to thank you for coming on and doing this. I'd love to hear you do a critique in the future of some of the problematic arguments that you've read or seen from Bart Ehrman. I think that would be really interesting. So let me know how that unfolds. I'd love to hear more.
Sure. Well, what I'm doing is I'm actually reading the whole book with a friend, and we're taking notes. We're going to do the first 4 chapters, and then we're going to go through page by page, the first 4 chapters.
That sounds like fun. And like I said, I'd love to hear more about that. So whenever you've completed that and you have some comments on it, please let me know. I'd love to have you back on to hear more.
Absolutely. I'll be keen to come on and share that.
So once again, thank you for coming on. Lewis, I appreciate you also being on and your interaction. Very, very helpful. And everybody, thank you out there in the chat for participating and watching. Hit that subscribe button. Check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support me. Pastor Green, where can people go to learn more about you?
Sure. My main website is engagingwithislam.org. engagingwithislam.org. And that's got, most of my material can go out from there. So I've got a YouTube channel, which you can link in from there. I normally do debates with Islamic leaders. But, and so that's why this topic has come up with Paul with them. And I'm hoping to have a debate on this subject with an Islamic leader as soon as we can organize it again.
And Lewis, anything that you wanted to plug?
This isn't necessarily something new, but I did finally get around to producing a LinkedIn. So now anyone who wants to see my stuff, there is one link that I can finally refer them to for it. And it has a connection to my theology blog, my Missile Reflections blog, as well as playlists of all the times I've appeared on the show.
Awesome. And that's a LinkedIn
link. I'll send you the link.
Yeah, that'd be good. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, once again, gentlemen, both of y'all, thank y'all for coming on, and everyone there watching and participating. I appreciate it. All right. That's going to do it, everyone. We'll see y'all. Have a good one. God bless.
Goodbye.